One of the problems with recruiting for investment banking is not the knowledge or skills you acquire, but the access to talk with real investment bankers to put your best foot forward. Our sponsor, WSO Academy, can provide those connections with 60 head mentors who are finance professionals at top firms like Goldman, Centerview, and JP Morgan. Imagine being able to get on the phone within 24 hours with one of the Academy's 1,300 mentors right before a critical interview. Get on the waitlist for WSO Academy today by clicking the link in the show notes or by visiting wallstreetoasis.com/academy. All right. Welcome to Investment Banking Insights. My name is Alex Mason and I am your host. This is the show dedicated to helping you learn both the technical and non-technical aspects of investment banking as you go on your recruiting journey. So I'm so grateful that you're here with me today. We are going through discounted cash flow analysis, all of the basics. And of course, we've been talking a lot about terminal value, a lot about how to calculate DCFs and ultimately figure this part of the whole process out. But the question I have today for you is more of a general question about DCFs. How do you know if your discounted cash flow analysis is too dependent on future assumptions? How do you know if your DCF is too dependent on future assumptions? Now we know, of course, in DCFs, there's a ton of assumptions. We've covered many of them already. You have to assume a certain discount rate. You have to assume within your weighted average cost of capital, your cost of equity, all of those components, your cost of debt, cost of preferred, if there's that, also the consideration, the ratios between those different values. You have to go with all sorts of assumptions for revenue and on and on and on. It just keeps going. But how do you know ultimately if your DCF is too dependent on these assumptions? Obviously, it's going to be dependent on them, but there are limits to what you can do in a model. And there are certain things that can tell you if your DCF is a little bit too unrealistic. And here's one of those things. So remember that at the end of the day, in a DCF analysis, we're summing up the value of two sets of discounted cash flows. There are those in the medium-term future from now until, say, 5 to 10 years out in the future in general. And then we have the terminal value portion of future cash flows, which are farther in the future. So some component of the company's value will be derived from this first set of cash flows, and some will be derived from the second set of cash flows. That is the terminal value. Because remember, at the end of our DCF analysis, we take the summations of each of those cash flows, add those together, and that gets us the enterprise value. Or in the case, if we're looking at levered cash flow and just using cost of equity, that would get us the equity value in that case. But it's giving us the value of the company. So as a generalization, if your discounted cash flow analysis shows that a company's value derives over 50% of that value from the terminal value portion, then your discounted cash flow model might be too dependent on future assumptions. So let me repeat that. If your DCF shows that your company's value derives more than 50% from the terminal value portion, your DCF might be too dependent on future assumptions. And really, this might happen frequently. And again, I'm going based off of what I've read. I haven't seen this enough yet personally to be able to tell you this from personal experience yet. But from what I know, this actually happens relatively frequently. It's actually not too uncommon to see your DCF portion, or rather your terminal value portion, make up over 50% of your overall value. But if the company's value coming from the terminal value is really high as far as the proportion, like 80, 90% range of the value of the company, then yeah, that's probably too much. That probably tells you your DCF is too dependent on your assumptions for the future. And why does this make logical sense? So remember, we've got this medium-term summation of cash flows and then this longer-term summation of cash flows. And then we're adding them together. That gets us the value of the company, right? Either equity value or enterprise value, depending on what we're using as a discount rate. So with that being said, let's say that the medium-term value of the cash flows makes up 50% or 70% of the value of the company. And then the terminal value portion makes up 50% or let's say 30% of the value. What is that telling us as investment bankers? Well, we're looking at this company and we're saying that, okay, most of the company's value is going to be created in the next 5 to 10 years, in the next several years. And then some value will be created in the far future. But really, the bulk of this company's value is going to happen kind of in this middle term future period. And that kind of makes sense for most scenarios, right? Because let's say that you and I owned Apple stock in, let's say, 2005, right? In 2005, what was Apple doing? They were making the iPod. The iPod was already a huge hit. They created the Shuffle. They created the video iPod and all these different iterations, the iPod Touch. And then they took this giant leap and created the iPhone, which completely changed the world, right? 2007. Then iPhones gradually took over the entire smartphone market, effectively creating an entirely new market of electronic devices. Fast forward through the 2010s, you see more market penetration. And now here we are in 2023 as I'm recording this. And Apple has released the Vision Pro, augmented reality. Whoa, totally changing the game, right? And it's still really, really early. I mean, as I'm recording this, people don't even have these things in their homes yet. It literally just got announced a few weeks or few months ago. So maybe it'll accelerate Apple's growth yet again. But my point is that Apple has had some incredibly high growth years over this 10 to 15 year, well, more like 10 to 20 year stretch. Really phenomenal growth. But I think it's safe to say that the future growth of Apple is probably going to be less than the growth we've seen in the past 2 decades. And so the main value of the company, the primary value that's created this $1 trillion corporation, literally over $1 trillion as of the time that I'm recording this, like that happened because of iPhone sales primarily and because of Mac sales, iPad sales, etc. Those products revolutionized the company and generated a massive amount of value. Now, the terminal value portion of the calculation, say we were doing this DCF model all the way back in 2005, well, the terminal value portion from, say, 2025 onto forever might not be that much relative to the value that was created in the interim. So what I'm saying is that if you're assuming that the terminal value is going to create the majority of a company's value, then you're really saying that your discounted cash flow model is too dependent on the assumptions. Because remember, what are we assuming if we're assuming that most of the value comes from terminal value portion of the calculation? Well, we can use the multiples method or the Gordon growth method. And either of those methods, we're basically making a really big assumption on long-term growth rates or the multiples from precedent transactions and comparable companies. And those are big assumptions to make. If those assumptions are basically the driver of 80 to 90% of the value of a company, well, then that's relying super heavily on those assumptions, as opposed to the medium-term portion of cash flows. If we're just looking at that for a moment, when we're looking at revenue drivers, we're looking at free cash flow in years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's a little bit more fine-tuning that can be done there, as opposed to if we use the Gordon growth model for terminal value and just say, yep, I'm assuming long-term growth rate of 4%, and then the entire model shows that most of the value comes from that terminal value portion. Then things might be too dependent on assumptions. I hope I'm explaining this one clearly. This one's a little bit tougher for me to describe, I think, in a simple way, but hopefully that Apple example helped a little bit. But fundamentally, what we're saying is when you're looking at these two portions of the equation, medium term versus long term, the long term portion, if you have assumptions in that long term portion that drive almost all of the value of the entire calculation, then you're probably relying too much on those assumptions. So that's really what I'm saying. So that's what I got for you today here on Investment Banking Insights. I'm really grateful that you're listening here. Alex Mason, your host, as always. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.